morning, ladies and gentlemen, from the audience and from Zoom as well. It is a pleasure to open this second day session, and we have a very special speaker in this session, Professor Marcel Bras. He's in the School of Mind and Brain, Department of Psychology, Humboldt University of Berlin, Germany, where he holds the Einstein Strategic Professorship, also the Excellence Cluster, Science of Intelligence, and in Ghent University, in Ghent, Belgium, at the Department of Experimental Psychology. Professor Marcel Bras needs no introduction. His work is very well known to everyone in the field. Most of the important work on the field has some relation to his work, and you will see his name over and over in important papers and research. But I have to say, more important than, I mean, not more important, but also Marcel is one of the most generous academics I've met. Very, very open to talking and exchanging ideas, and really a great guy. So Marcel, thank you very much for being here. Round of applause. Before Marcel, Gabriel wants to say a few words as well.
Yeah, when Renato called me and told me that he was going to Belgium to work with you, and I said, okay, great, because this name appears in half of my bibliography, you know. Half of my PhD bibliography, I have Marcel Bras there, you know. So I think I never met you in person, but I always loved your work.
So thanks a lot for this very nice introduction. Put some pressure on me, I have to admit. But at least I can stay the nice person, even if my talk isn't that great. So thanks for inviting me to Brazil. It's really great to be here. I was doubting until the last moment whether it will really happen. I think the last time I really traveled beyond Europe is 2 years ago, and it was quite exciting to come here. And I'm really glad that it finally worked out, and we didn't have to cancel it in the last minute. So again, thanks for inviting me. So my talk today partly overlaps with a meeting in June or July, as it was. But today I will only focus on beliefs in free will and the question whether beliefs in free will influence social perception. But before I will outline my research, I would like to set a little bit of the general ground for this belief in free will research. Talk a little bit about our intuitions of conscious free will and the neuroscientific findings that are related to it. So one fundamental aspect of our sense of agency is this subjective experience of being able to freely choose between different alternatives. So when you go to a restaurant and you try to select your meal, you can choose between different options. You can go for pizza or for pasta. And even though you are aware that your choice is not completely free, so if I'm going to a restaurant with my wife, for example, we mostly share dishes, and then specific dishes are not on the table. But in general, you have the impression you deliberate on the menu, and then you can choose. And you have the impression that in principle, at least, you could do otherwise. So this intuition of conscious free will is nicely depicted in this graphics. So you have the options, you have deliberation. The degree of deliberation, of course, depends on the decision that you have to make. If it is about whom you marry, it will be presumably more deliberation than in the restaurant, hopefully. But and then you have your conscious decision and you implement your decision. I think that's how most of us experience decisions in a lot of situations. However, this intuition of conscious free will has been challenged. First of all, it has been challenged by philosophy and physics quite a while ago. And this challenge is called causal determinism. So the basic idea of causal determinism is that every event is determined by previous events and the laws of nature. So in principle, already during the Big Bang, it was clear whether I would go for pizza or for pasta in the restaurant. I mean, this sounds very nice, but at the same time also very weird and not very intuitive. And I think that is presumably the reason why this idea of causal determinism wasn't really adapted by people rather than philosophers and physicists, I think. But there is a more modern version of determinism. It's a little bit questionable whether it has the same status as causal determinism, but at least it was put forward like that. And this is what one could call neural determinism. And neural determinism states that our conscious decisions are determined by unconscious brain activity preceding our decisions. So now it's not the Big Bang that already determined what is happening. It's only our brain a few seconds or a few hundred milliseconds before we actually decide to go for pizza. And the evidence for that stems from experiments, most famously the classical Libet experiment that were first carried out 35 years ago, almost 40 years ago. These experiments show that our conscious decisions are preceded by brain activation. In the Libet TARS, the conscious decision to press a key is preceded by a specific brain potential, the readiness potential, by a few hundred milliseconds. There is also fMRI work, and I was luckily involved in that a few years ago together with John Dylan Haynes, where we used a different method, namely fMRI, to predict the decision based on a pattern of brain activity using a relatively fancy method, multivariate method. And there we could show that you can predict the decision even seconds before participants come up with a decision. Now, the basic idea of this is put down in this cartoonish way. So there is this unconscious brain which decides for us a few hundred milliseconds or even a few seconds before we become aware of it. And this unconscious brain then tells us you have to do A. And then there is this conscious decision that comes afterwards, which in principle only confirms this kind of unconscious brain decision. And then you become aware, oh, I want to do A. That was more or less how the story was told. I mean, more recently, this has come into question, and there is some doubt about the Libet's findings. And I don't want to go into detail with that because it's not really relevant for my story, because what I'm going to talk about is about the influence of free will beliefs on behavior. And what is really relevant for my story is that this neural determinism seemed to be more plausible for people on the street, so to say, than the causal determinism. Because a few years ago, you could find these headlines in relatively common newspapers: why we don't really have free will, or how free is your will, or free will, now you have it, now you don't. So interestingly, this kind of neural determinism seemed to be much more plausible for people than causal determinism. And it looks as if people really might change their view about free will. Now, the crucial question is, does it really matter whether people believe in free will or not? And I will say a few words about that in a minute, but before I will discuss this specific question, I would like to discuss more generally the power of beliefs, as I would call it. So is it plausible that high-level beliefs, such as free will beliefs, affect our behavior? And I think it's highly plausible. So if you look at religious beliefs, for example, I mean, we know that our culture, our cultures, our behavior has been determined by religious beliefs for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. So people went to church on Sunday, they killed because of their religious beliefs. So it's highly plausible that such high-level beliefs can make a difference. And interestingly, these high-level beliefs can also change. So if you look at the map in Europe, how many people believe in God, you have a number of countries nowadays where only a minority of people really believes in God. So this has changed. Only 50, 60 years ago, presumably the majority of people still believed in God, and they lived a life that was more or less in accordance with this belief. Nowadays, in a lot of European countries, at least, people changed their belief. And interestingly, at least as far as I know, nobody showed that God exists or doesn't exist. So there is no change of knowledge. It's only a change of belief here that seemed to make the difference. But I would want to give another example of how convincing beliefs are. And this relates to the talk of Gabriel yesterday. Another form of belief, more low-level belief, that shows that beliefs can be very strong and very influential are placebo effects. So in principle, a placebo effect is a belief in the efficiency of a specific medication. And even though we know that there are not only effects of beliefs and placebo effects, there are also conditioning effects, but there is also a strong contribution of beliefs. And it has been demonstrated that these beliefs can change brain processes, not surprisingly, but they can also change more low-level neurobiological processes that can go to the brainstem, neurotransmitter stuff. So these beliefs can change things on a very low level in a way. And that, of course, doesn't mean I wouldn't claim, I'm not a dualist. I wouldn't claim that this is not related to physiological processes. I think these beliefs are represented in the brain, but these high-level representations in the brain can strongly affect low-level representations and even physiological processes. That is a point I would want to make. Now, I would like to return to the question, does it matter whether we believe in free will or not? So now that I hopefully have convinced you, or at least partly convinced you that beliefs can matter and can have strong influences, does it matter whether we believe in free will or not? And here philosophers like always have already paved the ground to address this question. I mean, there is some philosophical discussion about this issue for quite a while. And I think there are at least three positions, three theoretical positions. The first one was nicely formulated by David Hume. And he argues that it doesn't matter because our intuition of free will is so strongly rooted in our behavior and emotions that we won't behave differently if it turns out that we don't have free will. And he gives a very nice example. You are going down the street in Rio and there is a robbery and somebody robs your money. You run after him, you get him. You will be angry of the person. And it doesn't matter whether you are determinist and in principle assume that free will doesn't exist. You will be angry. You presumably want him to be punished. He argues it doesn't really matter. But then there are other philosophers, as always, that put forward a different position. And this different opposite position comes in two different flavors, in a kind of negative flavor and in a positive flavor. And we have already heard about that in Renato's talk. The negative flavor was put forward by Zaus-Minansky, who argued it would be catastrophic if people would disbelieve in free will. because this would completely undermine our moral intuition. So in principle, he outlines a world where our whole moral intuitions and institutions will break down if people really figure out that free will is an illusion. I'm not sure how plausible this really is, because people, when religious beliefs were questioned, already argued in this direction, and I'm not sure whether they were really right. But this is a different discussion. There is also a more positive view on disbelief in free will, and this was put forward by Derek Pereboom. He argued that it would be positive if people would disbelieve in free will, because they would give up on concepts such as retributive punishment. So he argues if people would figure out that free will doesn't exist, they would give up on stupid concepts such as retributive punishment, because from this kind of punishment wouldn't make sense. That doesn't mean that punishment in general wouldn't make sense, and that was nicely outlined by Renato yesterday, but at least this kind of retributive punishment wouldn't make sense anymore. Now, these are the theoretical positions, but I'm an experimental psychologist. I'm a psychologist. I want to see data. So I became interested in an empirical investigation of the question whether free will beliefs matter in a way. And the first time I came in contact with that was on a conference in 2009, where Al Mealy was also there and Kathleen Voss. And there Kathleen Voss described her research on manipulation of free will beliefs and how it affects moral behavior. I will come back to that in a minute. In general, there are two approaches to investigate the influence of free will beliefs on behavior. One approach is an experimental approach, and the other approach is a correlational approach. And I will briefly outline these two approaches and their merits and problems. So the experimental approach usually goes like that. You have two groups of participants, and before the experiment, or before participants carry out a task, they get an anti-free will message, so to say. And in a lot of studies, this is a text from Francis Crick, the guy who found out about the structure of the DNA. I don't know why he is qualified to talk about free will, but this is a different issue. But he's a Nobel Prize winner, and that seemed to make his argument very strong. And this passage is about free will, and I will read a brief part of the passage. You, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of the vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So although we appear to have free will, in fact, our choices have already been predetermined for us, and we cannot change that. So he puts forward this idea that free will is an illusion, that our behavior is determined. He also argues against dualism. So this text is quite, the whole text is quite heterogeneous. So one group reads this anti-free will text, I will call it. And the other group gets a controlled text. I won't read this one. It's about consciousness, not about free will. It's from the same book, so the complexity of the text is very similar to the texts about free will. And this is a control group. Now, in the first studies that were reported in the literature, and these were studies by Kathleen Voss and Roy Baumeister, they found quite strong effects of this free will belief manipulation on cheating and on antisocial behavior in a way. More recently, there have been some doubt whether these studies can be replicated. And I would like to briefly refer to a meta-analysis that we have recently done. Oliver Genschow is the first author of this meta-analysis. Jonathan Scholar is also involved, and a few other people, where we wanted to see whether the manipulation works. And interestingly, if you look at the free will questionnaire, it seemed to work. So these kind of text manipulation change people's beliefs about free will, at least as they are measured in classical free will questionnaires. Both of free will and also of determinism, the effect of free will is a little bit stronger than the effect of determinism. So this looks quite nice. However, when you look at the effects of these manipulations on downstream behavior, so on cheating, for example, and antisocial behavior, the picture looks a little bit different. So here you see all the studies that have been reported in the meta-analysis. We also get data that weren't published, quite large data sets that haven't been published. And if you look at the effect here at the bottom for antisocial behavior, there seemed to be a small effect of that. It's very tiny, to be honest. And the downside of the whole thing is that the effect stems primarily from studies that have small samples. So the squares that you see there show the size of the sample in these studies. So the studies that show an effect are usually small sample studies, while the studies that have large samples usually don't show any effect. I think that is not really decisive, but it indicates at least that if there are effects of free will beliefs, they are very weak, and you need huge samples to show them. And something similar holds true for cheating. Okay, so this is the experimental approach. I mean, the advantage of an experimental approach is, of course, that you can draw conclusions about causality if you manipulate free will beliefs. The alternative approach is a little bit weaker in this sense, and this is a correlational approach. And the correlational approach works like that. You ask participants to carry out a specific experiment or whatever, and then you correlate the results with data in a free will questionnaire. And I show here a free will questionnaire that is at the moment most widely used, the free will inventory. These free will questionnaires, or this free will questionnaire has 3 scales of free will scale. Their example items, people always have the ability to do otherwise. And there are other items, of course, in the free will scale 5. Then there is a determinism scale. Everything that has ever happened had happened precisely as it did, given what happened before. This is in principle the formulation of causal determinism. And then you also have a dualism score. Okay. I mean, the advantage of this kind of approach is you do not rely on the strength of the manipulation. You in principle take the natural variation of free will beliefs that exists in the population, and then you correlate that with your experimental effects. The disadvantage is, of course, that you can't say anything about causality, and there is always a possibility that there are moderating variables or influencing variables that you don't have in your design, and the effect can be explained way differently. Okay, these are a few methodological considerations when you are interested to investigate the influence of free will beliefs on behavior. Now, I would like to return to my original question. So does it matter whether we believe in free will or not? And in the remainder of my talk, I would like to outline a series of experiments in which we try to investigate this question. And I will focus on experiments where we looked at social perception. So how free will beliefs change the way we interpret the behavior of others. One reason why I've done that is because that is more recent work from my group. We have larger samples, while the stuff on behavior directly is older work, and I'm not so 100% sure whether everything of this research can be replicated. Okay, but this is a side note. So the fundamental question is here, do free will beliefs change the way we perceive other people and other people's behavior? And the basic idea or reasoning behind this research is that if disbelief in free will determined the idea that we are free intentional agents, then we will presumably also perceive other people's behavior as less intentional. So if I'm only a biological machine, as was put forward by Crick and others, then presumably others are also only biological predetermined machines. So then the question is, how much room is there for attributing intentions to other people? So the general hypothesis is lowering free will beliefs should reduce our attribution of intentionality to other people. And the first question that one has to address is, on which level would you expect these effects? And recently, we thought it would be interesting to start on a very low level. So whether free will beliefs affect social perception. And one of the most basic phenomena or characteristics of intentional agents is the way they move. And that is, you can nicely see that in these point light walkers. So even though you don't see a person here, you immediately recognize that this is a human, presumably a male, walking in a specific way. So we are very good in detecting this biological motion, and we can also infer very specific information from this biological motion. So you could argue that this is a most basic form of agency intentionality detection. So we were wondering whether belief in free will is related to detecting biological motion. So we set up an experiment in which participants saw these point light walkers, but in noise, so that it was not really clear whether a point light walker is in there. I don't know whether you can see it. Okay, right. So it's in the center. It's the same point light walker like this. But in our experiments, the orientation of this point light walker also changed. So it was not so easy to detect the point light walker. And we also had a condition where there was no point light walker, where the point light walker was scrambled and then it completely disappears in the noise pattern, so to say. So we showed these left videos to participants. We varied the degree of destruction and also the orientation of the point light walker. And then we also asked participants to carry out a free will questionnaire. And when we were correlating the results of the free will questionnaire with performance in this biological motion detection task. And we had two dependent measures. One dependent measure is sensitivity. So how well are you to detect that there is biological motion, or to reject that, or find out that there is none. And the other dependent measure was the response bias. So do people have a tendency to attribute a biological motion into the stimuli, even if there is none? And the results, this is a huge an aggregation over a number of experiments here on the left side. The results were really disappointing. When we correlate that with the subscale, the free will belief subscale, the sensitivity, we find a correlation, but it's a very tiny one, and it only gets significant because the sample size is so huge that you get almost everything significant. And in addition, the direction of the effect is in the wrong. It's the wrong direction. So here, people who are high in free will beliefs are less sensitive to biological motion. For the response bias, we also found a very small correlation, but this correlation was not significant. And here it went in the right direction. So people high in belief in free will had a tendency to attribute kind of biological motion even when there was none. Okay, but overall, in principle, there is not much in the data. So our hypothesis was disconfirmed. Now, you might say it's a crazy hypothesis anyway, that these high-level beliefs should affect these kind of low-level social perceptual processes. So I think that is a fair point, but luckily, the data tell otherwise, because when we correlate sensitivity and response bias with the dualism scale, we find quite reliable relationships between dualism and sensitivity, and between dualism and response bias. So dualism seemed to be related somehow to detection of biological motion. And we followed up on this, and at the end of the day, it turned out that what is really driving the effect is presumably that dualistic beliefs correlate with paranormal beliefs, And people with paranormal beliefs, they see things where there are none. And not only biologic emotion, but you find similar results also if you correlate dualistic beliefs with a random dot motion task where there is no biologic emotion. So that's a conclusion of this research. But for our research question, the answer to our question is it doesn't seem to affect these low-level free will beliefs, doesn't seem to affect these low-level social perceptual processes, at least not detection of biologic emotion. So the next level we investigated was whether free will beliefs relate to attribution of intentions. And this is a study I already showed in the last conference. Nevertheless, it's one of my favorite studies, so I will show it again. And I will show you a video that motivated this study. And when I thought about this this example again, I was really reflecting about the talks yesterday where you had this serious things of people burning themselves or killing other people that were innocent. And I figured out that I always use football as an example. I don't know what that tells about me. I'm not even a football fan, but for some reason I like this football example. So here in Brazil, I think this is something that presumably might interest you because this is your football enemy, isn't it? Argentina. In '86, Diego Maradona, the quarterfinal against England, and then this happened. Unfortunately, we don't have the sound that raises a little bit the emotions. Okay, so yeah, but it doesn't matter. So emotions are very high, and then this happened. So Maradona, he scores a goal. He is really enthusiastic. He runs to the sideline, but his fellows, they are not so enthusiastic. They come, but very slowly. And the English players are protesting. They're saying it's hand. It's really, it wasn't a goal, but the goal was given and England lost. Here from a different camera perspective, it's not 100% sure what is happening. But afterwards, a photo from behind the goal clearly indicated he intentionally pushed the ball into the goal. So it was completely intentional. His take on it was, it wasn't my hand, it was the hand of God who was doing this. Okay, this is a different story and relates to religious beliefs. But the interesting thing here is that in football, handball depends on whether it was intentional or not. I mean, here it's very clear, but there are situations where it's less clear. And I would like to show you a video that we used in our study. This is material that is used by Swiss referees to train the referees. And they have to decide whether this was intentional or not. And that, of course, then decides what kind of action their referee has to take. So we showed participants these videos, and then they had to determine whether the handball was intentional or not. They had to decide that on a Likert scale. And then we correlated this intentionality rating with free will beliefs. And what we found was that there was quite substantial positive correlation between free will beliefs and perceived intentionality. This is an aggregate score of the free will scale, but you also find it if you only look at the subscale. So there seemed to be a correlation, a relationship between belief in free will and how much intentionality you attribute to an agent in a situation where this is not 100% clear whether the agent acted intentionally or not. We did another study where we used a classical set of stimuli that were designed in the 40s by Haider and Simmel, where you see shapes interacting in a way, and most people can't help attributing intentions to these shapes. Nowadays, these stimuli are used to investigate autism because autistic individuals also attribute less intentionality to these shapes. But I think for most people, it's obvious that there is a meaningful interaction and that the shapes act in a very intentional way. So we showed these videos to participants. There were 4 videos, no, 8 animations, and then participants had to rate the perceived intentionality. They had to say whether the agents behaved intentionally and whether the triangle movement was random or not. And then again, participants completed the free will inventory and we looked at the correlation. And these are the results. Again, we found, I mean, these correlations are not huge, but they are very reliable. And I think for this type of research, you wouldn't expect much higher correlation. So we found a correlation between free will belief subscale and the rating of participants. Determinism was also correlated, but negatively, which is nice. And dualism wasn't correlated, which is also nice because it shows, I mean, in the biologic motion example, I showed you that the effect was primarily driven by dualism. This is certainly not the case here. Okay, so from these studies, I would like to infer that free will beliefs seem to be related to attribution of intentionality in these situations where it's not 100% clear whether an agent is acting intentionally or not. Okay, so the next level we wanted to investigate was the level of assigning responsibility to the behavior of other people. So now we are coming closer to the stuff that was discussed yesterday by Renato. So the basic idea is if you believe in free will, you assume that people can act intentionally, then you can also make them responsible for what they are doing and you can punish them accordingly. In this study, which was published a few years ago, we used a classical social psychological effect to investigate this question. It's called the fundamental attribution error or the correspondence bias. And the basic idea of this social psychological effect is following. The fundamental attribution error describes the tendency for observers to attribute other people's behavior to internal or dispositional factors and to downplay situational causes. I mean, in this example here, it's quite obvious if you see the driver stepping out of this car and you are asked, what is the reason for the accident? Most people will say the driver was reckless, he was driving too fast, and presumably only a few people will say the road was slippery or the road signs were misleading. Of course, this has also to do with this contextual information, but in general, we have the tendency to attribute behavior to people rather than to the environment. In particular, in other people, in ourselves, we sometimes do it oppositely, in particular if our behavior has negative outcomes, but this is a different story. Okay, so this is the design of the study. First of all, we used the free will belief manipulation. At that time, it was already clear that it was not always easy to find effects with the manipulation. So we really tested a huge sample. We did an online study where you can test hundreds of participants. And then participants had to read 4 stories, and I will give you an example of these stories. A doctor at a large hospital, David Connor, provides treatment for many people in the Baltimore area. He specializes in surgeries and performs them often. Recently, a woman underwent routine surgery to treat her stomach ulcers. During the surgery, an avoidable mistake was made and the woman died. David Connor concealed the mistake and told the woman's family that she died of a heart attack. And then participants were reading these stories, and then they had to answer questions, 2 statements that were supposed to measure attribution to external factors such as social atmosphere, social norms, or contextual factors like this Ferrari thing, and 2 statements measuring more internal factors such as the character of David Connor, his attitudes or his temperament. And at the end, participants, oh no, this is a spoiler, participants had to complete the free will inventory. And again, we first correlated free will beliefs with a fundamental attribution error. And again, we found a substantial correlation between those. So people high in free will attributed responsibility more to the person than to the environment. So showed a stronger fundamental attribution error. And interestingly, we also found an effect in the manipulation. So in principle, the difference between the gray and the dark gray bar for the anti-free will and control group was larger in the control group than in the anti-free will group, which demonstrate that in the anti-free will group, where we diminished belief in free will, they were showing less of a fundamental attribution error. I mean, this was significant, but the effect wasn't very strong. And at the moment, there's a huge replication effort to try to replicate the study. And I'm really curious. I mean, with the correlations, I'm 100% sure we showed them in a number of experiments. With the experimental data, I'm curious whether they can replicate it. Okay. We also investigated whether this fundamental attribution error only showed up, or the relationship only showed up for negative behavior, also for positive behavior. And what we found was that people having strong free will belief praise people more for positive behavior and punish them more for negative behavior. So it's not only an effect that relates to punishment, but also to positive behavior, which of course gives a different perspective on the Derek Pereboom story, because that would also mean that people high in free will beliefs, I mean, if people wouldn't believe in free will, they also would praise people less than before. Okay, now one fundamental question of all this research is, of course, how socially relevant it really is. So we have these relatively artificial experimental contexts where we find small correlations between free will beliefs and specific behavior that is measured in an experimental context. But the claims that are drawn based on these experiments are quite wide-reaching. The claims are that in principle, if people start to disbelieve in free will, it will completely undermine the structure of our moral behavior, and this will have fatal consequences. So I think it's an interesting question how relevant this research really is. So, and I think social psychologists are always better in addressing these questions compared to cognitive psychologists. And there was a nice study by Sharif and colleagues in 2014, where they wanted to test whether beliefs in free will are really related to the degree to which people punish other people for negative behavior, and in particular, if it is only about retributive punishment. So what they did was they gave participants these text passages. So you had an anti-free will passage and a neutral passage. And then they had scenarios where they described a criminal committing a criminal deed, and then participants, and in their study, these were simple, I think, presumably psychology students, but I'm not sure. They had to indicate the sentence. And what they found in a couple of experiments was that the severeness of the prison sentence was influenced by the free will belief manipulation in the expected direction. So people high on free will beliefs, or in the anti-free will belief manipulation, where you diminish free will beliefs, I mean, one has to say that they are still, people are still believe in free will, even if they are diminished. It's not that they don't believe in free will anymore after reading this passage, but nevertheless, in this group, people said they would punish the person less. In particular, and this was what they manipulated as well, they told people it's not about deterrence or prevention, it's only about retributive punishment. Okay, so this looks as if people really hold people more responsible, and if they would be in a position to punish someone, they would punish him more severely if they believe in free will. But I mean, these are people on the street, and I mean, in the US system, you have these juries where people from the street have to judge criminals. In Germany, you don't have that. You have the judges. And the crucial question is, of course, would judges also be influenced by this manipulation? And at this time, I have a friend who was at this time judge in a district court in Berlin on a relatively high level. And he was always interested in this research. I was discussing it with him. So at one point we thought it might be interesting to try to collaborate and set up a study where we investigate whether judges would be also influenced by this type of manipulation. So we set up this study. This is already a few years ago, and it took us quite a while to publish it. This is also in collaboration with Oliver Genschow, I already mentioned previously. Okay, so the study looked as follows. Enzo, this is the name of the judge, he convinced 87 professional judges to participate in this study, which is quite an accomplishment, I think. And most of these judges were quite experienced, had 16 years of experience on average in private law. Then we used the free will belief manipulation. And at that point, we were already discussing whether we should use a classical Crick manipulation. But it's always difficult if you want to replicate a study with a different population. You better take the manipulation that was used in the previous study that you would want to replicate. So finally, we decided to use a Crick text. And then we designed 10 scenarios that were more geared to the German legal system, where a criminal deed was described, and then the judges had to recommend a prison sentence for the offender, and had to indicate how long he should serve in prison. I mean, in this study, we didn't explicitly say that this is only about retributive punishment. I think that would be also a little bit difficult with professional judges. So we didn't explicitly mention that. So here, the judges based their judgment not only on retributivism, but also on deterrence and prevention. Okay, and then the judges completed the free will inventory. First of all, of course, we were interested in the question whether our manipulation, so we had these two groups, the anti-free will group and the control group, all judges, whether this manipulation would work in the judges. You could imagine that, I mean, they have this kind of philosophical background, they get that in their legal training, so they are not naive about this. It could have happened that the manipulation wouldn't work, but interestingly, it worked. So we found indeed a reliable difference between the anti-free will group and the control group in the free will questionnaire. Now, the crucial question is what happens in the prison sentences. And here there is a small numerical difference between the two groups, but it's not reliable. And also, if you do a Bayesian analysis with which you can evaluate the null hypothesis so that there is no difference, there's anecdotal evidence for this null hypothesis, that there is no difference between the two groups. But as I told you, I mean, whether the manipulation works or not is controversial anyway. But what really convinced me was that if you correlate free will beliefs across the two groups with the judgment, you don't find any reliable correlation. And here the Bayesian analysis even provides moderate evidence for the null hypothesis. So I would infer that professional judges are not really, I mean, the relationship between free will belief and their judgment, at least in these hypothetical scenarios, is not correlated. And they seem to be less influenced by their free will beliefs when they judge criminal cases. Okay, and now we are 59 minutes. I come to my conclusions. So first of all, I showed you that belief in free will is unrelated to detection of biologic emotion. So at least with biologic emotion, we don't find any relationship on this low level. But we found a relationship between free will beliefs and the way people attribute intentions to other people, the degree to which we hold others responsible for their behavior, but such influences might be counteracted by professional training. And this is something, I mean, it's only a hypothesis. We had 90 judges, but this has to be replicated and further investigated. So I'm really happy that Renato is trying to continue this work, because I think that's exactly what is needed, that people from law become interested in this and they have better access to the population. So I'm really looking forward to Renato's future research. I would like to finish with thanking the people who did the work and participated in the work. This is Oliver Genschow, postdoc in my lab that is now junior professor in Cologne. He's doing very interesting social psychological work. Very original guy. It's really fun to follow his research. Emil Krakow is another postdoc in Ghent who is now in a different group because I left Ghent. Methodologically very strong. He was behind these meta-analysis and also is now convinced to do free will belief research. Then Heinz Havikhorst, he's called Enzo by his friends. He was a district court, now he is emeritus, and he gave us access to this unique population. And last but not least, Wei Peng, a PhD student from China, who did the research on free will beliefs and detection of biological emotion. And this is, of course, quite a tricky type of research, not always very rewarding to not find the effect that you expect, but this is empirical research. And I would like to thank you for your attention, and Renato and Gabrielle again for inviting me to this great meeting.
Marcel, thank you very much. This was incredibly clear, and it's complete and a very, very good overview of the entire field. I have a lot of questions I could ask. I will try to restrain myself.
Please, only one question at a time. My
yes.
working memory is very, very small. I can only answer one question, not these 3 question philosophers kind of asking.
I will, yeah, as I said, I will restrain myself and give others time to ask as well. But I'd like to start, and I mean, let's see.
We have plenty of time for debate because keynote speakers have 1 hour and a half, and Marcel very gently just used 1 hour, so we have 1 hour for debate.
I don't know whether I will stand 1 hour today, but okay, we'll see.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds better.
So, okay, then I will be able to do some of the questions. But first, I'd like to ask you, you've shown the funnel graphs for in the meta-analysis, and you've shown that the manipulations work, right? But you've shown them for free will and determinism. And I've been wondering for a long time, shouldn't we start, and this is not original from me, and it's a question that's been around in this free will beliefs literature, and I wonder what you think about it. Dualism manipulation, manipulating dualism and looking at the consequences in free will beliefs, in determinism beliefs, and in behavior itself, and what do you make of it, and what do you think we should do? And okay, I'll leave the others.
No, I think that is a very good point. And as I told you, I mean, we find different patterns for free will and determinism on one side and for dualism on the other side. And I mean, in some of the research I presented, we also have used an aggregate score over the whole scale, and then it really mixes up the whole thing. I think we have to treat these scales differently, at least the dualism and the determinism of free will belief. I mean, my idea is that dualism is a slightly different thing, so to say. As I told you, We found that dualism is strongly related to paranormal, or others found that before, strongly related to paranormal beliefs. And then you, I think, are in a completely different ballpark. So I think dualism is a kind of different story. And it might be very interesting to investigate this story. I absolutely agree. And we did in this biologic motion task. But I don't think that is so strongly related to the classical free will story.
Thank you.
Thanks for a great talk. I wanted to know what you think about the scales themselves, the dualism, the determinism scale. So it seems to me that dualism and determinism are binary questions. It's either determinism is true or it's false. These scales give you some kind of spectrum, and it seems like what would be more probative would be just to say, this is what determinism is. Do you agree with this or not? And how confident are you? Not, sort of, I have a sort of spectrum of belief about determinism. So I'm just wondering what kind of influence you think that the scales have on the results.
Yeah, I think that is a very good point, because in principle, the way the scales are conceptualized, you could argue it's more this kind of psychological notion of free will, that you have more or less of it depending on the context. I don't know whether it worked if you would ask people, do you think people have free will or not? Because I think people don't have such an idea. They don't have the idea. Usually they don't come up with this causal determinism idea. I think free will doesn't exist, or I think free will exists. I think they usually, I mean, the common notion of free will is more graded. That under specific circumstances I have more of it, and under others I have less of it. And then, of course, you could argue how strongly is that related to the philosophical notion of free will. And I think here you really have a point. I think it would be interesting to investigate that, and whether people would be able to say yes or no. I think you would force them into something they wouldn't want to do otherwise.
Question, I think that there's a cogent way of thinking about free will as something that's graded, something maybe inversely proportional to various constraints, not necessarily determinism or something like that. So, but with questions about determinism and dualism in particular, those two seem to be binary questions, not scale questions.
Yeah, I think conceptually they are. Whether people conceptualize them like that is another question. I'm not sure whether people say, okay, I'm a dualist. I mean, I think most people will have some dualistic beliefs, and if you push them, they will say, under one or the other, they will provide a kind of dualistic perspective on stuff. I think most people will, even though they might claim on a more abstract level that they are not dualists. I think that's a very interesting point. And I think this also relates to a more general point. I mean, and this is something, of course, I have to admit, I also did. I mean, we use the scales that were most widely used, but I think there must go more research into the scales themselves and the psychometric concepts that are used here. I think Thomas Nadelhofer already did a great job with this scale, but nevertheless, I think we have to think more closely about it. And we recently started a kind of research topic where we also looked at free will attitudes rather than beliefs. So you can say, I believe free will exists or not, but I can also have an attitude towards it. I would like it if we have free will or not. We have recently done some research that shows quite a dissociation between these free will attitudes and beliefs. And if you then look at the manipulation, you will see that the manipulation not only acts on the belief level, but also on the attitude level, because his critics, at least, is very dismissive about, I mean, he almost says people believing in free will, they are stupid, more or less. So I think there are a lot of things to explore, and I absolutely agree that this is the research that we have to do if we want to continue with this kind of psychometric correlational approach. Then we also have to identify other variables that might be correlated. We have to determine discriminant validity of the concept. So I think that it's very crucial to do all the psychometric homework if you want to continue with that. And I have to admit, I was always hoping that the experimental manipulations would work, because then you don't have to go this route, but presumably you will. Thanks.
Yeah, wonderful talk. So the field seems to be dedicated to a notion of free will belief as implicitly a cognitive belief.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, it might also be true that free will is not solely a cognitive phenomenon, but also a feeling, an emotional commitment to the idea, or to that your actions make a difference in how your future will turn out.
Mm-hmm.
So this might be true also of animals. So for example, in Seligman's work on learned helplessness,
Mm-hmm.
he puts a dog in a cage, it can't escape, you know, a red light comes on and it gets shocked. And you do this for, you know, a couple of hours, and eventually the dog lies down and does nothing and complains when it gets shocked. Then he opens the door and typically the animal doesn't leave. So he called this learned helplessness. So I'm just wondering if a different kind of manipulation for the field would be to try to manipulate this sense of agency, which is not cognitive, but more emotional or visceral. And so, for example, could you do studies where you manipulate this in a positive direction, like look at people who have taken the outward bound course on, you know, survival skills, and typically this leads to an increase in feelings of agency, or look at prisoners who are locked in, you know, or you might even, you know, duct tape people to the chair or not, and see whether this has an effect on their attributions of it, you know, responsibility or intentionality.
A very good point. And I mean, in principle, you outlined my research programs that I have with my Einstein professorship. What we are trying at the moment, we want to use also environments that are more plausible, like these text passages. So we are using VR or game environments where we try to manipulate people's agency, and what it boils down to. And then want to investigate how this changes, first of all, their high-level beliefs, but also their direct behavior, because in these kind of VR environments, you can, of course, directly test whether, if there is someone who is committing a criminal deed, how you would punish them, whether you shoot him or something like that. So that is, I think, a very interesting idea. And in particular, I think that these gaming or VR environments might be very good for that, because people are really immersed in these environments, and they take the kind of contextual constraints that are provided by these environments for granted in a way, at least as long as they are in the environment, maybe even above, but this is a different question. So I think this is a great possibility to manipulate these kind of experiences of agency and different experiences in a very convincing way, and then directly investigate how it affects behavior. Of course, we are not in the real world, but I think we are relatively close to the real world, certainly much closer than with these text passages. And then another approach would be indeed to look at groups, at prisoners, which I think then gives you the ecological validity benefit, but of course all the confounds that you buy in with that. But I think this is exactly the direction we have to go. We have to come away from these very abstract kind of manipulations, but use more concrete manipulations. And again, philosophers have come up with these thought experiments. The difference is we can now implement them in a VR environment and see what happens, how people behave in this environment. So yes, I think it's very interesting.
There are some of these strange studies where they manipulated not agency, but hope. which is something I think is understudied in philosophy and our field. But there was a guy at Hopkins in the 50s who was trying to understand drowning. I think the Navy was giving him grants. And so he had rats. And he put them in a barrel of water and they measured when the heart stops. There's a little clip on the ear. And it was something like, 4 minutes. 100 rats, you get a nice bell curve at 4 minutes. But one time the technician forgot to put the clip on the ear to measure the heart, to measure, when they would drown. And so the technician came back, took the rat out, put the clip on and put the rat back. And that rat swam for 76 hours, right? So it became a different kind of rat because of that very small intervention. And it's very hard not to anthropomorphize that rat because it seemingly had now hope that it might be rescued again. And so even animals seem to be influenced by something like a belief. And this might be another interesting direction.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting research line. Also, to what degree animals have intentionality. I mean, I have a dog, and if you have animals, you wouldn't doubt it. But of course, there's a lot of anthropomorphizing in that reasoning. But I think it's a very interesting question, and I think it is a very trying to address that experimentally, as you describe, is a very interesting topic. Unfortunately, I don't do research with animals, and so somebody else has to do that. But I think it's a very interesting avenue.
Before I go for my question, I'll ask Peter to tell everyone about the luggage you lost, because I'll make a case with a real story, please.
I don't know if I want to get in trouble with Islam, but I was taking a flight I was a poor student and I needed to go to Germany where I was studying. And so I took the cheapest flight to Frankfurt from New York, and it was Pakistan Air. And the flight was going to Karachi. So I got off in Frankfurt and my luggage didn't arrive. And it went on to Karachi. It had my best leather jacket, my best leather boots. And so then I went to the Pakistan airline people and I said, where is it? And they said, oh, it went to Karachi. I said, okay, well, what are you going to do about it? Well, nothing can be done about it. And they said, and if it had not been lost there, and then it would have been lost at the same time somewhere else. So basically, they were saying it's the will of Allah. So I said, well, it's the will of Allah that you give me $500 because otherwise I need to buy it. Anyway, but this mentality that that nothing you do makes a difference and the things are inevitable, I think it's obvious it makes a big difference in how people behave. Yeah. Anyway, I'll probably get killed now. So great. Thanks.
Yeah, very nice example.
Now that Peter told us the story, me and Renato are talking like an hour about that, the results of the free will inventory in Turkey. They are very different from the correlation between dualism and beliefs in the freedom of the will is very big in the Western world because of our Judeo-Christian background. But the more people believe in dualism in the Muslim creed, the more that they believe in destiny. So that I think will be a great cross-cultural research to see if the beliefs and the attitudes correlate. The more because it's like a comparison between Eastern and Western relationship, the relationship between dualism and the freedom of the will, and try to see if you manipulate beliefs, you manipulate attitudes or not. I think that would be a great line of research. It's kind of a suggestion.
Yeah. David Wisniewski has done some cultural comparisons, and he is also involved in this attitude research. I'm not really into this cultural stuff, but I think it's extremely interesting. And I think in general, for me, the most important the most important aspect of this research is this question: how strongly do high-level beliefs, such as religious beliefs, cultural context, that form beliefs, influence the behavior of people in a way? And I'm quite convinced that these influences are quite strong and also happen on a very low level in a way. So I think this cultural comparison is extremely interesting. Yeah, but again, this is a very tricky area because you have a lot of confounds that you have to exclude. And again, like with Adina's question, I think really people who are strong in psychometric research should take on this endeavor and investigate that. I always wanted to compare people in Flanders, because I lived in Flanders for 14 years, with people in the Netherlands. So the cultural background is in a way very similar. So economically, they are very similar. They speak the same language. The country looks quite similar, flat and sea at the end. But I mean, their mentality is completely different. And I think this relates to the history, to the history with other nations, but also to the religious history. I mean, most people are secular anyway, but in Flanders, they have a kind of Catholic tradition, while in the Netherlands, it's very Protestantic, at least most parts. And this seemed to have affected their behavior so strongly, it's unbelievable. I think it is an interesting area to look at.
Yeah, the idea of Flanders and comparing Dutch with people from Flanders is very good because, as you said, you have all the other variables controlled, and it's really a question. And the Netherlands has not just being like more Protestant oriented, but also a country in which kind of political freedom was really important, and also a religious tolerance. So they have a very kind of special relationship with freedom, I would say. And the Flanders culture is very Catholic at the end. So it's, and all the other variables are controlled. So I think it's a great comparison for sure.
Thanks.
Thank you for your talk, Marcel. So I want to ask a question similar to the one Adina asked, but not so much about the yes or no question, but a different concern with the scale. So it is hard for me to really understand what determinism is. And it took me a while to think how, the different ways in which determinism was characterized would add to a denial of free will or not. Dualism is not either a simple idea. And, just trying to understand what the consequences of dualism would be for a bunch of things that we do in real life, it's just really hard for philosophers and for people in general. So one worry with the scales is that they're just at a level of generality in which it's really hard to know. I mean, we know what people answer, but we don't know exactly what are the underlying attitudes that are being expressed with the answers that they give. And this happens a lot every time philosophers and psychologists work together in the materials for an experiment. We just have this very abstract things that it's hard for our participants to kind of parse out. So I wonder, if you've thought about this, and what do you think would be how promising would be to just try to kind of bring down a little bit this scales, or make them a little bit more concrete and less abstract. So asking questions people about whether, people deserve to be punished for the wrongdoing, whether people have the general ability to change their characters, whether, how much of a contribution of luck there is to personal success, whether people are predestined to achieve, these things that are a little bit more telling of I suppose, the practical implications of having or not freedom versus the metaphysical possibility of freedom. And whether those things would actually make asking the questions in those terms would actually help us address the big question which you're trying to answer, which I think is the really important question, whether belief in free will makes a difference for our practical lives or not.
Yeah. As I already said in response to Adina's question, I think this is, I mean, this is research that has to be done. I think the problem is always, I mean, what kind of construct do you want to measure in a way? And I mean, if you start with these abstract philosophical conceptions of free will and dualism, and then of course you have to measure it in a relatively abstract way to capture these concepts. If you want to get more at more basic psychological concepts that are related to free will, like luck and I don't know, then of course you might design different scales. The question is always, are you measuring the same thing? And I think this is in principle a kind of dialogue between psychologists and philosophers to figure out what you want to measure, and then to empirically test what you are really measuring in a way. I don't think that there is a right or wrong way. It's simply a kind of question what kind of construct do you want to measure, and are you able to measure the construct? And I mean, with these abstract concepts, the question is, of course, how are participants answer them? Do they answer to the question, or do they come up with their own idea because the whole notion is too abstract for them in a way? That's again the question of whether you measure the construct that you want to measure. And at the end of the day, these are conceptual questions and psychometric questions. And therefore, I think in principle, philosophers and psychologists have to put effort into that. But honestly, I still think that the scale, the free will inventory, is already quite good. But I mean, yeah, you can always extend it.
No, I was not trying to. Sorry, I was not trying to criticize the scales. I think the scales are helpful and they do a certain job. Maybe I guess different way of asking my question is in terms of which construct you're interested in. So there is clearly a construct that's described by this scale, and whether that's the same construct that was animating you to ask the question whether belief in free will, in the same way that belief in a deity, or in the same way that belief in certain other things would make a difference for the kind of lives that we live and the kind of social institutions that we want to support, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, that is a very interesting question, and I think I'm a little bit in between both sides. On the one side, I find it extremely interesting to see how this very high-level abstract beliefs influence behavior in a way. But the question is whether people really commit to these abstract beliefs, or whether they, at the end of the day, come up with their own notion of these abstract beliefs, which is more psychological. And when we're discussing with Peter this agency kind of manipulations, these are psychological manipulations. I mean, about control, agency kind of stuff. I find that very interesting as well. And you could ask the question, isn't that a completely different line of research? Is it really about these abstract beliefs, or about psychological constructs that are related in some way to a kind of soft notion of free will or determinism in a way? I don't really have a clear answer to that. Yeah.
What we see from the meditation field is we have huge differences between novice and experts. So the line of research you developed together with Renato, that probably will show the kind of causal correlation, how much the training has effect in controlling your own beliefs and acting the way you're supposed to do as a judge, for example. Maybe people that are studying to I don't know, undergrads in legal studies will react with much less control than highly trained judges, for example.
I think there is work in progress. There is this huge Templeton Free Will project where also the participants of the grant and these are real experts, are asked about their beliefs. And I don't know whether and how they will follow that up, but I think it's an interesting question. I have another comment, because it's also related to this Templeton grant, because I have a collaboration with Uri Maus, and we wanted to see how language, I mean, different language use influences free will belief, because the notion of free will in Romanian and Germanistic languages is quite different. One is about choice, and the other is about will, in a way. And there we had the problem that how, I mean, if you present these kind of questionnaires, then you have the words in the text, so it's in a way confounded. So we try to come up with a kind of cartoonish depiction of these situations. And I mean, we have some data, but not enough yet. I'm really curious how this works out. And then, of course, on the manipulation side, of course, you can also try to think about different aspects that you can manipulate, and see how this works. I mean, also the manipulations are extremely broad in a way, and you don't really know what they are doing. So it would be interesting to have more targeted manipulations that manipulate specific aspects of this notion of free will.
And this is a question about, I'm going to ask you to speculate about why you got the null result. So one possible explanation has to do with the legal system. So the kind of considerations that are relevant for punishment allocations are not ones that have to do with free will. So that difference is not going to. But a different explanation has to do with, they're just using, base rates to answer the question. So they're, thinking about similar scenarios that they have seen in the past, and they're just, approximating to whatever sentence they've given in the past, regardless of, any other beliefs that they have. So I wonder if you have any sense of how is it that expertise is it the norms of the system by which you become an expert, or is it past experience that's accounting for the null result here?
Yeah, I think first of all, we have to make sure that the null result is not simply a power issue. So we need this replication work. But otherwise, yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. I really don't know. I could imagine that the experience plays a role. I mean, if you have very clear standards, how you would judge a specific case, then of course the influence of such beliefs might be reduced. On the other hand, if it is really about their experience, then you would expect that people believing more in free will, I mean, they are the experts in a way. They provide the judgments, and I don't know, they are not really, or most of the time they are not really externally evaluated. So if they have a specific idea, then they can pull it through over their whole career. So maybe it's about the norms. I don't know. But I think that's really the work of the law people to figure that out.
Can I chip in on that? Actually try to answer in some way. The vignettes, the 10 vignettes that the judges were supposed to, to attribute punishment to, they were very unusual, all of them. They're not the kind of cases you will see in your day-to-day life. I mean, of course, there is some kind of automatism. I definitely think there is a part of that, but I would not say, and this is something very usual we find when we study judges' decision making. If you give them a decision that they have taken over and over, you won't see an effect of bias or framing or this kind of thing. But if you break it into something that is different, and then you will see an effect of framing and or other kinds of biases. And these cases, most of them were very, very different. For example, this guy worked in a factory and he left the control panel to watch a soccer game. And then they had an accident in the factory which killed 2 people. And so, I mean, no judge has ever judged a case like this. I hope so. But so it was kind of a different case. What we are trying to do to answer this is we will do replicate this with judges here in Brazil, but also we will do the same study with students in the first semester and in the last semester of the graduation. So we will try to separate what is due to legal education and what is due to legal practice, right? And that is how we try to parse it, to separate it. So just, sorry, Marcel. Just
no, absolutely. I mean, that's great. I mean, this is exactly the kind of research that has to be done. And it has to be done by people like you, not by people like me. I'm a psychologist. I mean, or by us. Yeah.
So this is also following up on that and just a hunch, but you know, I think the judges are really trained to think about the matters of law and to discard any kind of intuitive and emotional way of going about it. And just an illustration recently is the Kyle Rittenhouse case in the US, which I don't know if you guys followed, but this guy who killed people during a Black Lives Matter protest who had, you know, gone down there specifically with a rifle to, as he said, protect the shopkeepers. And, you know, I just thought this guy, he should be thrown away for life, you know. And my brother-in-law is a lawyer and kind of a talking head, and he made the prediction that he would be found innocent. But because the way the law is written, you know, he said that's actually the correct judgment in this case, even though this guy is clearly guilty, right? But he's not guilty as a matter of law. And so I think that training to sort of separate the judgment, you know, sort of the retributive judgment that you might make that might actually be correct in terms of who's blameworthy from the law is something that they're trained, you know, judges are trained to do. And I think that you might find that that's really what the distinction is that you're seeing. But of course, it really depends on those cases. I have no idea what they were looking at when they made those judgments.
Thank you, Marcel, for this inspiring talk. My question is about the dualism scale.
The what? Sorry.
Dualism scale.
Yeah.
Scale. So this scale is, if I understood well, is intended to distinguish if you as a participant are a substance dualistic person or a non-reductionist person, so to speak, more in general. This is my question.
How this scale is designed?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay.
That's my clear answer. I don't know whether anybody in the audience.
Okay, because I think there are different implications.
Can you outline that a little bit?
Yeah.
What implications this would
If
have?
you are a dualistic person in the substance dualistic sense, you can say that there is a non-scientific position, and this can be influence your opinions about free will. But if you are a non-reductionist, you can also be an emergentist person, for example, which can be considered a scientific position, or no, or maybe is not an anti-scientific position. So if all the non-reductionist people are inside the dualistic position, it can be influence the results. But anyway.
I mean,
if
we
you
can
look-
discuss it maybe later. We
Yeah,
can go
we
through
can.
the items and see. how
It could be interesting
Yeah.
to look at
Mhm.
the items. Okay. Okay.
We have some questions from the audience in Zoom. So Professor Sinara sent a question. Thanks, Marcel. It is just a clarification question. You said in the conclusions that beliefs in free will is related to the degree we hold others responsible for their behavior and the way we attribute intentions to other people. How this go? The more people believe in free will, the more people hold other people responsible for their behavior. The more they believe in free will, the more they attribute intention to other people. So that is the question.
Yes, exactly. That is the idea. And I mean, that we haven't really directly tested, but the idea is because I attribute more intentionality to other people, I also hold them more responsible for what they are doing. I mean, if I think you are just a machine, you couldn't have done otherwise, your behavior was not intentional, I presumably would also hold you less intentional.
Can I follow something that just occurred to me? What do you think on this line of research of motivated free will beliefs? Do you attribute responsibility because you think people are free, or do you attribute freedom because you want to make them responsible for what they did, like in the line of?
Presumably, it depends on the people. Some
might
do one thing and others the other thing. I don't know. I mean, that is an interesting question, and it's also the question. I think it depends really on whom you are asking. I could imagine that people try to justify the holding others people responsible for that with this free will notion. But I could also imagine that there are people that where the free will beliefs are really the start, and then people that don't really have a strong motivation to hold others responsible.
Okay. So one last question from Zoom. So research with judges, with German judges, can lead us to conclude that we can train judges not to be influenced by free will beliefs. And so we will have less punitivistic judgments.
Yeah, but I mean, at least in the German law system, as we have heard yesterday, free will is an essential part of the system. So you can't really tell judges that, and at least if you don't completely revise the legal system, that they shouldn't consider free will in a way. So yeah, that would be problematic.
Any more questions? Okay.
Yeah, it's just a suggestion to build on your Flanders versus Netherlands idea. I mean, in your country, you have this natural experiment with the East German and West Germans, and we have this current system of North and South Korea, where presumably the cultures are quite similar, except they've been under very different systems. It would be very interesting to look at, say, judges who are trained in the DDR versus the West.
I think this is complicated. We are presumably a little bit too late for that. Because
well, for a certain generation, though, the people who are, late 50s,
it might be interesting whether one could see differences. I also don't know how many judges stayed in power after the wall came down. I mean, I know for sure after the Second World War that in Western Germany, all the Nazi judges stayed in power, but I'm not sure about it in the DDR. So, and also there is now 30 years of history gone over this. But in principle, it's indeed, it would be an interesting comparison.
Well, or just look at ordinary people and see how they, people of a certain age who are in the formative period, before 1989 or whenever it was.
And what would be your prediction that people in Western Germany have more free will, believe stronger in free will? Or?
Maybe a stronger sense of agency. I don't know about their beliefs. Yeah. Yeah. And then getting to the judges, I'm wondering if there is, okay, so you're implying that there's a sort of, I guess, positive effect in the sense that there's less of a correlation or even a null effect between beliefs and free will and punitiveness with training. But maybe there's,
not punitivism, because that is not what we measured really. So we didn't separate it, but we also have a part where we asked them afterwards about their motivation for the judgment. And this motivation was indeed correlated with free will beliefs.
Correlated with what?
With free will beliefs.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's not clear what's driving that. I mean, are they simply following a recipe or following precedent or inhibiting, their intuitions about, but I just wonder if there might be other sort of more negative effects of that. For example, in the Bible, the people who were following the letter of the law, like the Sadducees and Pharisees, did things that were actually against the spirit of the law. And, whether judges might, by following the letter of the law, have make mistakes in other directions.
But I'm not sure whether I completely get this point. Make mistakes? What do you mean?
So, for example, show less compassion in cases where ordinary people would show compassion.
Yes, I think this is something I mean, I think this relates to the discussion we had previously, that maybe they would, I mean, their judgment is less based on specific considerations, for example, emotional responses to a situation that other people would strongly take into consideration. Yeah.
So I'd like to thank Marcel a lot. We've been for a big round of applause. Thank you very much. It was a very fruitful discussion.
Yeah, thanks.
So we will be coming back at 2:30. Okay, so thank you.